Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm co-author of Patriots History of the United States, Larry Swikart, along with Michael Allen, bringing you a reading through the entire book of Patriots History of the United States. And we have been methodically working our way through. And I would say we are coming up to, honestly, what is the crux of the book, the key part of the early part of American history. I mean, if you set aside the Revolution Constitution, and that is the fight over slavery and what ultimately ends in the American Civil War. And so I'm starting in chapter 8, the House Dividing. Now, again, I am reading from the 15th anniversary edition of Patriots History. If you have an earlier edition, the headers will likely match. The page numbers will not match, so you need to go by headers. But if you get back much further than the 10th anniversary edition, even some of the headers have changed. So just keep your eye out for that. Also, a reminder, coming up soon, I will have available first as an add-on. If you buy a subscription to the VIP for history, a year-long subscription gives you access to almost 50 videos on different lessons, everything from Churchill to Reagan to things that every kid should know, things like this. If you buy a subscription to that, you will receive a complimentary updated version in PDF form of the 20th anniversary edition of the Patriots History of the United States. This consists of one very long chapter from 2018 to 2023, and perhaps 20 or more pages of inserted additional material throughout the book that if we could go back and revise the whole thing, we would put this in, if the publisher let us, of course, which we always have to fight that battle. So you might want to consider that. This offer will be available. Look for it in the newsletter coming up. Now, if you're not getting my newsletter, make sure you go log in to the wildworldofhistory.com. Not this YouTube channel won't get you there. You need to go log in to the wildworldofhistory.com. You'll be on our list. You will receive my newsletters, including all the great offers. We often give away free PDF books, so check it out. Also, my Patriots History of Globalism will be out in about 2 weeks. It's available on Amazon now for pre-order. Get your copy now. Now let's get started here. So we are in chapter 8, the House Dividing, 1848 to 1860, the Falling Veil. A chilling wire service report from Harper's Ferry, Virginia, reached major U.S. cities on October 18, 1859. Harper's Ferry, 6 a.m. Preparations are making to storm the armory. 3 rioters are lying dead in the street and 3 more lying dead in the river. Another rioter named Lewis Leary has just died and confessed to the particulars of the plot, which he was concocted by Brown. The rioters have just sent out a flag of truce. If they are not protected by the soldiers, everyone captured will be hung. The rioters consisted of 17 whites and 5 blacks, some former slaves, who intended to capture the federal armory in the city, use the arms contained therein to seize the town, and then wait for the, quote, army of radical abolitionists and rebel slaves that John Brown, the leader, believed would materialize. Brown, a Kansas abolitionist guerrilla fighter who had worked in the Underground Railroad, thought that the slave South would collapse if he conquered Virginia. Virginia militiamen hastily grabbed guns and ammunition, began assembling. Farther away, other towns, including Charleston, Martinsburg, and Shepherdston, awakened to warnings from the church bells and citizens mobilizing quickly to quell a rumored slave rebellion. Keep in mind that the concern about slave rebellion was overwhelming in the South. There were only a few, and none really very successful, but it was a constant fear among Southerners that there would be a slave rebellion. Let's see. The telegraph alerted Washington, Baltimore, New York, whose morning newspapers reported partial information. Many accounts referred to, quote, a Negro insurrection or slave revolt, hoping to avoid a full-scale rampage by the militias as well as intending to suppress Brown's insurrection quickly. The president, James Buchanan, ordered U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee and his lieutenant, J.E.B. or Jeb Stuart, to Harper's Ferry. They arrived on October 17th, by which time Brown, who had hoped he could avoid violence for at least a few days to allow his forces to grow, was forced to act without any reinforcements. Lee's troops surrounded Brown's motley band, then broke into the engine house at the train station near the armory where the conspirators had holed up. In the ensuing gun battle, the soldiers killed 10, including 2 of Brown's sons, and soldiers bayoneted Brown several times. He lived to stand trial, but his conviction was a foregone conclusion. And on December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was hanged in Charleston, Virginia. Today, that'd be Charleston, West Virginia, I think. Brown's raid triggered a wave of paranoia in the South and lived in utter terror of slave rebellions, even though few had ever occurred and none had succeeded. It also provoked Northern abolitionist sympathizers to try to differentiate the man from the cause. Quote, a squad of fanatics whose zeal is wonderfully disproportioned to their senses, was how the Chicago Press and Tribune referred to Brown. Quote, his are the errors of a fanatic, not the crimes of a felon, argued editor Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune. Quote, there are fit and unfit modes of combating a great evil, unquote. Few doubted Brown was delusional at some level, especially since his plan involved arming slaves and several thousand pikes. Historian C. Van Woodward warned historians looking at Brown, quote, not to blink as many of his biographers have done on the question of Brown's looniness. Woodward pointed to Brown's history of insanity and to his family tree, which was all but planted in the insane asylum arboretum. 3 aunts, 2 uncles, his only sister, her daughter, the 6 first cousins were all intermittently insane, periodically admitted to lunatic asylums or permanently confined. That's not a very good track record. However, the fact that he suffered from delusions did not mean that Brown did not have a plan with logic and order to it, nor did it mean that he did not understand the objective for which he fought. Such distinctions proved insufficient to those seeking a genuine martyr, however. Ralph Waldo Emerson celebrated Brown's execution, calling him, quote, a new saint, 1,000 times more justified when it is to save slaves from the auction block. Others, such as abolitionist Wendell Phillips, blamed Virginia, which he called, quote, a pirate ship, and labeled the Commonwealth, quote, a chronic insurrection. Quote, who makes the abolitionists? Asked Emerson. Quote, the slaveholder. Yet Emerson's and Phillips' logic absolved both the abolitionist lawbreakers and the Jayhawkers, Kansas border ruffians, and the rationale gave license to cutthroats like William Quantrill and the James Gang just a few years later to go and pillage enslaved areas. Worse, it mocked the Constitution, elevating Emerson, Phillips, Brown, and whoever else disagreed with any part of it above the law. One statesman in particular, one might say, realized that the abolition of slavery had to come and could only come through the law. Anything less destroyed the very document that ensured the freedoms that the slave craved and that the citizen enjoyed. Abraham Lincoln owed his political career and his presidential success to the concept that the Constitution had to remain above emotion, free from often heartbreaking injustices of the moment, if it was to be the source of redress. By 1861, when few of his neighbors in the North would have fully understood that principle, and when virtually all of his countrymen in the South would have rejected it on a variety of grounds, both sides nevertheless soon arrived at the point where they had to test the validity of Lincoln's assertion that a nation could not remain a house divided. Now notice, and we'll talk about this later, that he did not say the house would fall. He just said it could not remain divided because he understood that the goal of slavery was not to keep slaves in the South, as all those neo-Confederates who want to absolve the South for the Civil War want to point out, wasn't to keep slaves in the South. It was to expand slavery nationally, because the nature of slavery was going to be either that they would be people as they were defined in the Constitution. Remember, unfree what? Persons. Or they were going to be property like cattle or chairs or tables. And you could burn a table or kill a cow or whatever you wanted to do because it was your property. So Lincoln understood that sooner or later a fight would come legally, constitutionally, over the definition of a slave. Is a slave a man or not? And if a man, then ultimately the South could not keep slaves. And the South, don't doubt me on this, the South was desperate in trying to expand the definition of slavery as that of chattel property, and trying to expand slavery itself into the territories from which it could be reinterposed into the North, reintroduced into the North. The South's goal was always a United States of slaveholders. The North view was always a United States of free men. You can't get around that, no matter how much rhetoric you want to pile onto the states' rights argument. The logic is, to quote Thanos, inevitable. Okay. Page 265, An Arsenic Empire. Having added Texas, California, and the Southwest to the national map and finalized the boundaries with England over Oregon, the nation in 1850 looked much the way it did more than 150 years later. Within 20 years, Alaska and the Gadsden Purchase would complete all continental territorial expansion, with other additions to the United States, to the Union, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, coming from the Caribbean and the Pacific. Polk's War interrupted only temporarily the rapid growth of American industry and business after the Panic of 1837 had receded. The United States stood behind only Russia, China, and Australia as the largest nation in the world, whereas its economic power dwarfed those states. By European concepts of space and distance, America's size was truly astonishing. It was as far from San Francisco to Boston as it was from Madrid to Moscow. Texas alone was bigger than France, and the Arizona Territory was larger than all of Great Britain. The population, too, was growing. Science, invention, and the arts were thriving, and a competitive balance had again reappeared in politics. Throughout her entire history, however, the United States had repeatedly put off dealing with the issue of slavery. First through the Constitutional Compromise, then through appeals to bipartisan goodwill, then through a political party system that sought to squelch discussion through spoils, then finally through the compromises, all combined with threats and warnings about disunion. By the 1850s, however, the structure built by the founders revealed dangerous cracks in the framework. Philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson warned that the acquisition of the Mexican cession territories, with its potential for sectional conflict, would be akin to taking arsenic. How much longer could the nation ignore slavery? And how much longer would the perpetual motion machine of growing government power spawned by Van Buren spin before abolitionist voices were thrust to the fore? The answer to both questions was not long. I mean, and this goes for any time, any place in politics. The circle always turns. It always comes back. And those who are on the bottom are going to be on top. This is why our Constitution argues for constitutional rights, free speech, rights to property, prohibitions against unlawful search and seizure, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. All these things, by the way, which we currently see being undermined by the current administration, right and left, all of these things are designed to protect both sides. That is to say, the founders and even Van Buren knew no one side would stay on top forever. And so you had to build a system whereby you had deference to the winners, and the winners had charity to the losers. That didn't mean you went along with their programs. It meant you didn't treat them like Hitler would treat his defeated political foes and kill them, or like Stalin or Lenin would treat their enemies and wipe them out. You did not do that. You did not investigate rival political parties like they were some sort of terrorist organization, as the current administration does. You would not arrest political protesters who go into the Capitol for no other reason than to take selfies as some sort of violent extremist, as the current administration does. You don't do that. And one of the reasons you don't do that is sooner or later, you're going to be on that bottom part. I'm astounded by how many of my fellow baby boomers forgot the fact that they marched for civil rights. They marched against the Vietnam War. And by the actions of the current administration, they would all be in jail for very, very long periods of time for exercising their constitutional rights. So the system was designed to protect everybody, not one side or the other. And that's why the Constitution is such a genius, but why it requires active participation and energetic resolve and constant attention to maintain, even when you don't like what the other side is saying, because sooner or later you're going to be the other side. All right, we'll do about one more page here. The dark nether side. This is on page 266. Opponents of capitalism, especially those who disparage modern factories and big cities, began their attack in earnest for the first time in American history. Certainly there was much to lament about the cities. Crime was rampant. New York had as high a homicide rate in 1860 per 100,000 people as it did in the year 2000 based on the FBI's uniform crime reports. After falling in the 1830s, homicides in New York nearly tripled to 15 per 100,000 by 1860. Some of the increase in homicides came as a result of the influx of Irish Catholic immigrants, causing clashes between nativists and immigrants, and uniformed police made their first appearance ever in America. By far, the worst sections of New York's dark nether side, as reformers of the day called it, included Hell's Kitchen, which by the late 1850s had started to replace the Bowery as the most dangerous and notorious section of the city. Hell's Kitchen received its name from policemen, one of whom complained that the place was worse than hell itself, to which the other replied, "Hell's a mild climate. This is Hell's Kitchen, no less." According to one writer, the Bowery, Hell's Kitchen, and other rough sections of town such as Rag Pickers Row, Mulligan Alley, Satan Circus, and the Cockroach Row consisted of, and I quote, "streets ill-paved, broken by carts and omnibuses into ruts and perilous gullies, obstructed by boxes and signboards, impassable by reason of thronging vehicles, filled with filth and garbage, which was left where it had been thrown to rot and send out its pestiferous fumes, breeding fever and cholera." The writer found hacks, carts, and omnibuses choking the thoroughfares, their Jehu drivers dashing through the crowd furiously, reckless of life. Women and children were knocked down and trampled on. Hackmen overcharged and were insolent to their passengers. Baggage smashers haunted the docks. Rowdyism seemed to rule the city. It was at risk of your life that you walked the streets late at night. The club, the knife, the slingshot, the revolver were in constant activity. Not much different from New York today, right? Like other cities, New York had seen rapid population increases, leaping from 123,000 in 1820 to 515,000 in 1850, mostly because of immigrants, people Charles Loring Brace called, quote, the dangerous classes. Immigrants provided political clout, leapfrogging New York past Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in size, but they also presented a growing problem, especially when it came to housing. The tenement population, which had reached 500,000, included 18,000 who lived in cellars, in addition to 15,000 beggars and 30,000 unsupervised children, apparently orphans. When the state legislature investigated the tenements, it concluded that cattle lived better than some New Yorkers. Prostitution and begging were omnipresent, even in the presence of policemen who, quote, lounged about, gaped, gossiped, drank, and smoked, inactively useless upon street corners. Some women used babies as props, renting them and then entering saloons, inducing them to cry by pinching them to solicit alms. Gangs were also seen everywhere in the slums, sporting names such as the Dead Rabbits, the Gorillas, the East Side Dramatic and Pleasure Club, the Limburger Roarers. Politicians like Boss Tweed employed the gangs on election day, paid in cash and in alcohol to disrupt the polling places of the opponent, intimidating and, if necessary, beating up anyone with an intention of voting there. No wonder English writer Rudyard Kipling, who visited New York through the streets, thought the streets were first cousins to Zanzibar, foreshore or kin to the approaches of the Zulu kraal. Quote, a shipless outcome of squalid barbarism and reckless extravagance. Cast into this fetid urban setting were masses of immigrants. The United States moved past the 50,000 per year immigrant level in 1832, but by 1840, nearly 15 times that many people would arrive from Ireland alone. Overall, foreign-born immigrants in the U.S. rose from 60,000 in 1820 to 2.2 million by 1850. With Wisconsin, New York, California, and the Minnesota Territory receiving the most newcomers. In those states and Minnesota, immigrants made up 20% or more of the total population, but Ohio, Louisiana, Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were not far behind, since immigrants made up between 10 and 20% of their overall population. Steam-powered sailing vessels made the transatlantic crossing faster and easier, and the United States had generally open borders. Still, immigrants had to want to come to America. After all, both Canada and Mexico were approximately the same distance from Europe, yet they attracted only a handful of immigrants. Lured by jobs, land, and low taxes, a small standing army with no conscription, a relatively tiny government, complete absence of mandatory state-church ties, no state press censorship, and no czarist or emperor's secret police, Europeans thronged to American shores. As early as 1818, John Doyle, an Irish immigrant to Philadelphia who had found work as a printer and a map seller, wrote home, quote, I am doing astonishing well, thanks be to God, and was able on the 16th of this month to make a deposit of $100 in the Bank of the United States. Here a man is allowed to thrive and flourish without having a penny taken from out of his pocket. All right, we're going to stop there. I will pick up next time more on immigration. And a reminder, help me make Patriot's history into a feature film, folks. Go to Wild World of History, look for Buy Larry a Coffee, and buy me a $5 coffee. If everybody did that, all my Twitter followers and all my YouTube followers and all of my Facebook followers did that, we can make this movie in 6 months. So help me out, and I'll see you back here on Friday.